Welcome to this seminar. Today we are going to discuss on the current situation of Peru. Last week we have been having some big protests and a lot of political turmoil around the presidency. Well, President Vizcarra was impeached by this Congress, and that the reaction in the streets was huge. Has been one of the biggest protests that we have been in the last decade in Peru. There were protests in the whole country, and end up with the resignation of the Manuel Merino, that was the congressman that took the president, and an election, a new government again from the Congress with now the President Sagasti. What means this protest in Peru, in a country that has been going in the political turmoil for the last years? President Vizcarra closed the Congress at the end of September 2019. So, we have election for the new Congress at the beginning of this year, and this new Congress that has been elected now have been part of all this political crisis. To speak about this and to provide some insights and reflections on what means this protest and this movement, we have invited two scholars from Peru. Omar Coronel, that is a sociologist, but have a master's degree of political science from Notre Dame University, and he's a PhD candidate in the same university, and he's a professor at the Department of Social Science of the Universidad Católica de Peru. And Gisselle Vila, that she is a PhD candidate of geography at the University of Melbourne, and is a member of ECO Razonar. How we are going to do this is we are going to give some minutes to Omar and to Gisselle to make some small presentations where they are going to present some reflections on the situation in Peru, and then we are going to have some questions and then open the floor for questions from the audience. So please, Gisselle, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you very much, Camila and the organizers, for hosting this discussion. So I think my contribution can be on presenting a personal account of Peru's protests. I'm thinking personal because I recognize that my experience as a protester, as a woman, as a researcher of natural resource governance, and as a Peruvian largely create my insights. And account because it is only an account among many others, but I think it is perhaps one plausible way to make sense of a very diverse and rapidly changing civic movement. So I'm going to introduce with some instability. I'm sorry, guys, if some of you are not well familiar with how these events have evolved, but I think that perhaps this can also give you an insight about emotions and the body as the center of the protest experience. So I want to foreground the body as a critical angle to discuss the emergence of new political subjectivities. In this way, I do not intend to reduce all interpretations of the protest to just embodied experience. But at the same time, I believe that there is much to be gained when talking about body and subjectivity instead of just offering nuance to political phenomena. I argue that embodied experiences of protesters and the ongoing process of discussion and memorialization of these experiences have inaugurated a moment to redefine common understandings of democracy and citizenship. What these notions may become, I actually don't know, but certainly they are becoming, and it's important to note that and to stay with the trouble. By focusing on the potentiality of new political subjectivities, I distance myself from analyses that have exhausted descriptions of the Peruvian protests as a foreclosed event. By foreclosed, I mean that the protests have been predominantly subjected to a list-making descriptive experience, and that the final descriptions have served to embargo meaning-making from protesters. This is most evident, of course, in the case of mainstream media and the national government, institutional bodies that have been quick to adjudicate a triumphalist narrative to protest, hence bracketing protest and separating them from ongoing discussions. However, some analysts' interpretations have also overwritten senses and meanings about the protest. Political scientist Alberto Vergara, for example, suggested that he found in the protest calls for political reform instead of claims for more substantive change, such as, for example, the drafting of a new constitution. In a similar vein, other analysts find in the protest citizen practices of defending democracy or defending democratic institutions the main repertoires of resistance. These approaches, while useful to understand the overarching development of the process, fail to account for the ever-changing resignification of protest. That is, protesters' claims, demands, and political subjectivities change in the course of protest in a contingent and chaotic manner. On day one, when protests started, protesters had unclear claims, basically voicing anger against the Congress and nonconformity with the newly appointed president. On day three, demands were clearer, pointing to the resignation of Manuel Merino on the grounds of illegitimacy and almost certainly illegality. On day 6, after a night of extreme police violence that resulted in 2 deaths, over 200 injured, and nearly 100 disappeared, calls for police reform and justice mingled with feelings of rage, of grieving, of impotence. And during the whole week, voices calling for a new constitution, whatever that may look like, grew louder and louder. Now, I don't think that the claims and feelings in each day have been suspended or layered over those of previous ones. Rather, I think that feelings and meanings have taken shape in a relational manner, in a way that allowed the recognition of dignity and solidarity in the wake of shared experiences of brutal oppression. I imply that demands emerging from or definitions about the Peruvian protests are not conclusive, and perhaps we can learn something by focusing more on how collective emotions come together. Feminist communitarian and indigenous activist Lorena Capnal has written about how shared experiences of pain brought actions to protect the collective body. She calls it acuerpamiento. There is sincerely no English word that can make justice to this Spanish word. I thought of embodiment, but it is incorporation or incorporación. So I will leave it just as acuerpamiento, of taking a collective body. She refers with acuerpamiento to the personal and collective actions of outraged bodies that react to others' bodies' injustices. Bodies collectively support each other with affective energy against oppression. Capnal says, acuerpamiento brings us together in shared anger, but also in revitalization, summoning new forces to retrieve joy without losing feelings of outrage. Lorena Capnal's approach comes from her lived experience as a Maya Xinca woman of Guatemala, who altogether with her community has resisted the plunder of their collective territories, gender violence, and racism, among other forms of oppression. While she thinks about the rural indigenous movement, I consider that her approach is highly relevant to understand Peru's protests. I will point to 2 dimensions. First, because there is an undervalued connection with rural oppression in the recent protests. The premise I propose is that for the past 20 years, the regulation of natural resource governance through violent police practices in rural Peru allowed the development of an authoritarian muscle. A couple of weeks ago, we bore witness and/or directly experienced its exercise. Between 2000 and 2019, 299 people have died in the context of social protest. According to the Ombudsman Office, since April 2007, over 60% of all social conflicts in Peru have erupted over socio-environmental issues, such as gold mines that disrupt local livelihoods and damage the environment. The government has rarely required that mining companies, the police, or security forces provide meaningful compensation or redress. Oversight of mining operations is so weak that police and military forces sometimes sign agreements with companies to protect mines from protest. As the Human Rights National Coordinator has stated, repression of November 2020 protests builds on a long trail of abusive use of police force. Police behavior and the institutional order that protects it are an example of a shared form of oppression among rural and urban populations. Some of these ideas about natural resource governance and police violence come from a story co-written with Tony Bevington for the conversation that is coming out later today. The second dimension that I would like to point is that of emotion and motion, of how shared anger is coupled with revitalization as per the lenses of acuerpamiento. But contrary to it being just a single moment, the protests in Lima revealed that anger and revitalization are part of a loop where embodied emotions affect our course of action and sense of being. That those emotions of anger and impotence heavily underline organized action, but implies that these emotions also evoke responses to interact in a coordinated manner to support oneself and the collective body. A young self-summoned tear gas deactivator perfectly describes this. Quote, "Tear gas is one of the most important police gadgets. To take that away from them, gives our fellows a chance to keep protesting. I thought it was useful for them and for me because I've been tear gassed so often and it makes me so angry to be tear gassed when I'm only protesting. I thought, if you tear gas me, I'll turn it off. Let it be frustrating for you to know that the people can organize themselves and go against you, and not with violence, but putting off your violence." End of quote. A great deal of attention has been paid to the role of technology in mediating collective action. As the same deactivator concurs, access to information has mobilized us. However, the use of information and communication technologies and social media per se does not explain why someone would knowingly put their lives in great peril, even at the risk of death. Again, on this matter, the young tear gas deactivator lectures us. Quote, "We didn't know each other, but we were a great team. We felt so strong, all of us acting with so much solidarity, supporting each other. Then that made me feel good. That also helped me let the fear go away and focus on helping, supporting, and fulfilling our goal to turn off tear gas." End of quote. These quotes come from an interview by Angelica Mota to an anonymous deactivator. The deactivator's account suggests that just as much as paying attention to why people engage in protests, it is important to account for why they choose to stay. Here, Lorena Capnal's idea of revitalization aids in understanding that the sense of becoming into supportive and collective body against a shared menace, the police, is crucial to understand why and how people stand their ground. This interpretation also suggests a rapprochement to democracy as a civic lived experience. In that sense, protesters did not stay in the streets to defend democratic institutions or the rule of law, as many analysts have hurriedly suggested. Even the right of protest seems a tad limp. I think it has to be coupled with protecting the materiality of democracy, the collective body, our body. Approaching emotions and vitality may seem a bit frustrating for the social scientist or the politician who is more comfortable dealing with concrete demands. I consider, however, that this approach is beneficial because it points to a series of ideas or hypotheses, and with this I finish. I'm pointing to three ideas. First, that the trajectory of protest in Lima was critically altered by interactions with police violence. It is important to pay closer attention to the trajectory of protests from a relational perspective. Second, police violence builds on a long trajectory of impunity against marginalized bodies in Peruvian rural regions. Hence, attempts to implement justice and redress in the wake of protests should consider very deep institutional reform that reflects on state violence as a whole. The risk of not doing so is implementing, again, institutional reform in a piecemeal manner, very likely to shatter under changing political economic leadership. And finally, reducing protesters' experiences to ideas of claims for, repertoires, or defenses of, risk losing from sight what is brewing, that is, a process of becoming that is highly rooted in emotion, shared paths of struggle, the recognition of human life and dignity, a practice-based notion of solidarity, and a strive to revitalize resistance against oppression. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Gisselle. I think this, yeah, it's super interesting to try to, yeah, to reflect on what these protests mean and all the meaning of the protesters. And I think we still need to understand better tools to develop better tools to analyze these protests, because I think we are still thinking that this is the same kind of protest that we have in 2000, and it's not the same. We have been discussing about that, and in 2000 we were in a way trying to reinstall democracy, and in this protest is a lot of anger against the system, and I also I think it's important to see what is the difference of this from other kind of protests that go more with some concrete rights, so people have clear what they are asking for. In the case of environmental protests, or in the case of indigenous people in the Amazon, or in the case of the protests against mining. So I think that here was a lot of anger in a country that also has been in lockdown for the last 9 months. So 8 months. So COVID is a thing that probably people has been dealing and coping with that, and then come all these crises, and I think that also make people to be super frustrated and go to the street. But for sure we need a better tools to analyze this and think that this is people with a concrete asking for democracy or rebuilding institutions. Where these claims come from, I'm not sure. It's more like the institution that has been there, or is shared by the protesters, no? So yeah, a lot to reflect and to try to think about that. Please, Omar, it's your turn.
Thanks a lot. Thanks to Gisselle for that very interesting presentation, very thought-provoking. And thanks to you for the invitation to this discussion. Happy to discuss about the multiple crises of Peru anytime. So I wanted to begin by saying that what we had in Peru was definitely the largest campaign of protest in our history, right? So according to the last pollsters, we had like 13% of Peruvians participating in protests. So this means like 2.7 million of Peruvians on the streets. That's huge. That's huge not only for Peru, that's huge also for Latin America. So how we got there, how we could make so many people participate in protests. So first, I wanted to say we Peruvians, we protest a lot, and we have a lot of reasons to protest, as Gisselle has mentioned. So along with Bolivia and Argentina, we are one of the countries with the larger rate of protest participation in Latin America. Yes, we protest a lot, but generally our protests are very local. They are fragmented. We have problems to escalate these protests from local to regional or national level. Why? Many reasons. One of the main reasons is that our social organizations are very weak. We don't have strong social organizations. in comparison to, for example, Bolivia's indigenous organizations or Argentina, very strong, still strong union organizations, right? So we don't have that. And that's one of the reasons why our protests don't, we have many protests, but they don't escalate at the regional or national level. So that's important. But besides that, I would also like to talk about some context factors in 2019 and in 2020, right? So in 2019, many people were asking why Peru didn't have a protest outbreak, a big protest outbreak as other countries in Latin America. So you would remember probably that there were protest outbreaks in Chile, in Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Colombia. So many people were thinking, why not Peru, right? If we have so many problems, so many issues, very high inequality. So why we didn't have these large national protests as these other countries? So first of all, what I just mentioned, we have this problem of social organizations. Our social organizations are not strong enough to help us organize, coordinate larger national protests, but also some context factors, right? So first of all, we in 2019 had this president, Martín Vizcarra, who was leading a fight against corruption. And this is a particularity because in other countries in Latin America, we also have like very huge corruption scandals, but the governments are not doing that much to fight against them. Martín Vizcarra was at least performing to do something. But this performance had some very concrete consequences. For the first time in our history, we had like very powerful politicians going to jail, being imprisoned. One of them even committed suicide to avoid justice. So Peruvians, we were seeing that our institutions were doing something. Something is going on, right? It's not like we're quiet that nothing is going on, like in Brazil, like in Colombia, like in Mexico. No, in Peru, something was going on. The most important moment in this battle against corruption was when President Vizcarra decided to dissolve Congress in September of 2019. So Vizcarra, of course, he had no party. He had no representation in Congress. He had no strong allies. So what he did was to capitalize the popularity of this battle against corruption, and he confronted Congress. Congress, for those of you who doesn't know, is one of the institutions least appreciated in Peru. So what we thought in 2019 is that there were a lot of corrupt networks in Congress. So when Vizcarra decided to close Congress, when he decided to constitutionally dissolve Congress, of course, 85% of Peruvians were happy about it. 85% of Peruvians celebrated the dissolution of Congress. And of course, the popularity of President Vizcarra went to the roof, right? So Vizcarra capitalized this, and what Peru had in 2019 was this perception, this satisfaction with the perception of this fight against corruption. And that is something that differentiated Peru from other countries in Latin America, something very particular. That's one. Number two is that Vizcarra, as I mentioned, he had no strong allies, no party, no representation in Congress. So he depended on civil society. He depended on public opinion to remain in power. So that's why when confronted with social conflicts, he would generally negotiate, use dialogue. He would avoid repression because he didn't want protests to escalate at the regional level. Because when there is repression, of course, there are more reasons for protesters to escalate protests, right? So he avoided that. He tried to dialogue, he tried to negotiate, maybe not because of his normative preferences for democracy and dialogue, but because he knew he had to do this in order to prevent the escalation of protests. So these were two different things that the Peruvian government had in 2019 in contrast with other countries in Latin America. This satisfaction with the fight against corruption, and this government that wouldn't repress, this government that was more willing to dialogue, to negotiate with social conflicts. Okay, so that was 2019. In 2020, what we had was, of course, the pandemic, and Peru is one of the worst hit countries by the pandemic. So we had an economic crisis, of course, a health crisis, and of course, people is blaming Vizcarra at least in part for these results, right? So that's one thing. The second thing is that we elected a new Congress, thinking, okay, so we dissolved the Congress of 2019, this Congress should be better. And of course it wasn't, because our problem, as Camila was suggesting at the beginning of this discussion, is more structural in terms of the offer of the party offer, of the representation offer. So what we had is a new Congress with new corruption networks. So people was, of course, disappointed at this because there was an institutional solution to the crisis of 2019 that in 2020 it seemed like a failure, right? So we had again these networks of corruption in Congress, and again Vizcarra was representing like the protection against that corruption, until Vizcarra himself was accused of corruption, of course. And then what we had is also Peruvians very disappointed at their champion against corruption, because now Vizcarra was also in the same spectrum of corrupt presidents, corrupt politicians. However, even though we have this economic and health crisis because of the pandemic, even though we had this president accused with many charges of corruption, most Peruvians would prefer Vizcarra than any other to conduct the government until elections in 2021, right? So 78 in October, like a month ago, 78% of Peruvians mentioned that they knew Vizcarra was involved in some corruption networks, but they would prefer Vizcarra to lead the government until the end than to accept an impeachment or a vacancy or a removal of Vizcarra and had the more like menacing corruption networks taking power, right? So people would not accept an impeachment to Vizcarra. 78%, that's a lot, of course. So that's why it became such a surprise for us Peruvian when on November 9th, the Congress decided to impeach Vizcarra very easily with a very controversial constitutional figure and install Manuel Merino as his replacement. Manuel Merino represented all these corrupt networks in Congress. So that is very important because that implied that meant that many Peruvians, almost all Peruvians, according to one pollster, 94% of Peruvians rejected Manuel Merino as the new president. Okay, 94%. That's almost all Peruvians, and that is very important to understand why so many people went to the streets, why so many people protested from their homes, right? So we had a lot of protests in the past, but this protest was very large in part because of that, because many people perceived that this new president, Manuel Merino, was a threat to democracy, was a threat to the reforms, and was also a material threat because corruption, of course, was the consequences of corruption were very diverse. So that's why many people opposed to Merino, and that's why many people went to the streets. Much more people than in any other time, and particularly a portion of society, the youngsters between 18 and 24 years, the centennials, right? Many of them were for the first time in the streets attending protests, and of course they use new tools to communicate the protest. For instance, they politicized some social networks that were not politicized in the past, like Instagram and TikTok. And this, of course, means, as many of you would know, a qualitative difference in political communication, right? It's more fun, it's more ludic. So that's what happened, and many people, many youngsters, and everyone actually in Peru were sharing these images, sharing these videos about many people on the streets during these protests. So that's one thing. This is my first argument. There was a threat, this perception of a threat to democracy, but not only to democracy, as Gisselle was mentioning, right? But a huge threat to anything, even the small steps we had in reforming part of the education system, reforming part of the political system. So what happened on November 9th was perceived as a huge threat. And there is few things that mobilize more than this collective perception of a huge threat. And of course, since day 2, day 3, as Gisselle was also mentioning, we had a very concrete goal to oust Manuel Merino from the government, right? No matter what happened next, what our goal was to oust Manuel Merino from government. So that's one thing. The second step was that repression. And of course, Gisselle is completely correct when he mentions that emotions are key to understand mobilization, particularly in the Peruvian case, because we didn't have, as I was mentioning, strong social organizations. We didn't have strong social ties between activists to organize, to mobilize this. No, we didn't have any of that. It was the anger. It was the outrage because of the repression in Lima, particularly, what mobilized and what pushed organization on the march, right, on the fly. What we had was many of these centennials were protesting for their first time, right? They were on the streets for the first time, and these were protests that resembled more like a party, right? Parties on the streets. It was not by any means a violent demonstration, right? It was like a party. And that's why these centennials were completely outraged when they saw this level of harsh repression in Lima. Right, so that actually had a major impact among the people who were on the streets, and also among the whole society, because these youngsters, of course, were sharing on real time these images, these videos of the repression. So when the national television or the radio were not transmitting this information, it was the same, because everybody was receiving videos on Facebook, on Twitter, on WhatsApp about what was going on. So everybody was learning about the peaceful protesters and the very violent repression, disproportionate repression, right? So that created this narrative of these students who were not doing anything wrong, and this police violence that was completely unjustified. And even more important, something that Gisselle was also mentioning, that students confronted violence with peaceful organization, with solidarity, right? So they created these brigades, these health brigades, these tear gas bombs, disactivation brigades, networks of solidarity to help the families, the family of many of the victims. So there was an explosion of solidarity organization that was very well received for many Peruvians. So that was the narrative. These students were combating violence with non-violence, with solidarity, with this support among each other. And of course, the moment on Saturday the 14th, when the police repression killed 2 of these youngsters, Inti Sotelo and Brian Pintado, the outrage in Lima in particular, but everywhere in Peru, exploded, right? And we had started using during this protest a new repertoire, this cacerolazo, which is banging the pots, right, to create noise in a collective fashion. So that was organized right after these 2 students were murdered on Saturday on November 14th. So everywhere in Lima, you would hear the pots banged, and this you would perceive even in the middle of the night, I mean at midnight, this outrage of everywhere in Peru against this government that would represent, of course, this 94% of Peruvians that were completely against Manuel Merino as the new president, as the de facto president. So on Sunday, we had still a lot of students, a lot of youngsters, a lot of civil society on the streets prepared to oust Merino. But of course, Merino, at some point, his coalition and him realized that there was no point in trying to continue this charade, so he resigned. So that was the success we had in this protest. Merino finally resigned. That was the first thing one of the first reasons we can call this a success. But also the social movement, the protest on the streets, put as president somebody who was in the small minority who were against from the beginning to the vacancy of Martín Vizcarra. So we not only ousted Manuel Merino, but we put in place Francisco Sagasti, who's at least somebody who had a minimum of legitimacy right now in Congress. So what next? Is everything over? Was this only a protest of democracy against dictatorship? Of course not. As Gisselle has mentioned, these youngsters, these centennials who went to the streets, not only in Lima, but everywhere in Peru. This was not only the largest protest, but the most decentralized protest in our history. This mass is very heterogeneous. So right now there's a portion of these protesters demanding justice and reparation for the victims. There is another portion, larger portion, perhaps demanding the reform of the national police, which was not only repressive during the last week, but which was repressive in the last 2 decades, right? So, but before it was not repressive in Lima. Now it is repressive also in Lima, but before it was very repressive also in different parts of the country, which very minor attention. But besides that, we also have now a group that is demanding a constitutional assembly, right? Like in Chile. And that was a demand that was not in the streets before this whole crisis, but it is now on the streets. Some people want to change the constitution because they want to change the economic chapter, so they want to dismantle neoliberalism. But some other people want to change the constitution because of the political institutions that lead to this imbalance between the executive and the parliament, right? So there are many different reasons. Even more, there is also a portion of civil society that didn't participate in these protests, that are more conservative, more right-wing oriented. So what we have is a civil society that is much more diverse than before, and that is much more mobilized than before. So what I think we will see in the next weeks and in the next elections is going to be particularly a new generation that is much more informed about politics, and that is going to be more demanding to politicians about what they really want. And what they really want is very diverse. It's not only like this very Republican, democratic tradition of trying to develop the democratic institutions. It's really much more diverse camp of demands, right? So I leave it there, and I'm of course gonna discuss. I can discuss much of this during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I think one of the things that is interesting that you pointed out is that, like on Sunday, November the 8th, most of us were not thinking that he was going to be impeached. I mean, it's not. I think in September there was this process, because he has been through 2 processes. In September, I think we were more concerned about all the movement, but really on November the 8th, we were okay. In the morning, I think we started to be, it doesn't look so good, and in the afternoon was more or less okay. Seems that they are going to do this, and also is that they impeach a president that have more. I mean, is the president that has the highest popularity in the last 10, 15 years. So it's I mean, it's also who are you taking out from the presidency. But of course also shows the weakness of our political institutions. This is a president without a political party. Never had a political party. So he replaced Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, and he didn't have a group in the parliament, because in the parliament the political party from Pedro Pablo Kuczynski was for Pedro Pablo Kuczynski. Didn't like him, and then when become part of the opposition, they disaggregated. So also shows the weakness of our political institutions. Our political party system is not really a political party system, as we can see in other countries in Latin America. And also it's interesting because also this weakness shows why this Merino at the end just last 5 days. The streets took, but that is also super weak. Nobody support him. He didn't have any international recognition. So they went on this track without really, I don't know, mapping or understanding the feeling of the population, and without preventing to being taken out. Because if they will not be so violent in Lima, I mean, one thing you have to understand is, yes, we have killings by the police in other protests in the country. And this year in August, there were 2 indigenous people killed in the Amazon. But in Lima, I think we didn't have people that were killed by the police in the protests since 2000, probably. So this doesn't happen. And what's easy? And they make this huge mistake of being super violent, first on the 12th of November, then all the people were super concerned, saying, hey, you are too violent, just calm down, just say to the police. The Prime Minister go to the police, say to the police, well done, and then on Saturday, this end up with the killing of 2 young men, and more than 200 injured. Some of the people that are with serious injury that just destroyed their life. So the level of violence was insane, but also why they didn't control this, no? So probably because that is the only tool that they have to try to keep the power, but it was super weak also, only the police. And I feel that this also shows the weakness of our political system. And yeah, some people are asking for the Constitutional Assembly, thinking that we are Chile, but we are not Chile in the level of the political organization. So who is going to be elected to write a constitution? It's going to be the people from these political organizations. And I go to Gisselle so probably the way that we are doing the things is because there are not institutional channels, we just go to the streets, protest, reach our aim, and then come down, because the protests in Peru are going up and down all the time. So it's but in this case, it's so heterogeneous that what this can end is complex, as Omar you say. But what this means for next year and the electoral process, because we are going to elect a new government next April. The lists are already closed. The political parties that has been involved in supporting the Merinos, and they are going to be part of this. And that is the menu that we have. So it's also difficult to say to the people, you have to vote better. Yeah, for what? There is no possibilities. So I don't know how, I mean, just want to use 5 minutes for each of you, and then we try to open the floor for questions.
Okay, thanks, Camila. I'll go. I think I want to touch just 3 subjects based on what you just commented. First, on protest and this kind of sneaky pattern that we have. While I'm convinced of the power of protest in tackling regressive change, I remain highly concerned with what protests can achieve on the long term. And we have had example after example of reforms that were ignited by protests that were later dismantled, shattered, and reduced to its minimum expression. One of them is the case of prior consultation that emerged after the Bawa massacre, which is now even considered to just become some sort of online poll, basically. And I do think that on this accord, perhaps our role as social scientists is to bring forward dialogues between how protests evolve with how economic and political elites respond to protest demands. And in the case of last week's protest, it is important to notice that, as journalist Gustavo Gorriti mentioned, Merino ceased to oppress the people when he was disfavored by the military, because he was absolutely encouraged to elevate the tone and to repress with the use of military force. So I think this fact should not go underestimated. And I think that maybe we need to understand these two lines in tandem. The second thing that I would like to comment on briefly is about how a constitutional assembly may look like. I think that it is important to separate why people may want a new constitution and what means to implement these ideals are available. And I have the feeling that analysts have prioritized the latter instead of the former to disqualify the former. I think that there is certainly no clarity about how a constitutional assembly may look like, because as you mentioned, Camila, there are very corrupt actors in government and corrupt actors that would be summoned if a constitutional assembly is set forth. However, I don't think that this claim should be overwritten to the demands of people that are claiming for very, very deep institutional changes. I mean, maybe not even institutional changes, but changes in the rules of the game per se. So they may relate to the economic chapter, as Omar was mentioning, or to the political chapter, but also I'm thinking about the rights for nature, which is something that indigenous movements have been pushing forward for many years. And under the momentum we're experiencing now, these different claims are in a process of becoming. They're in a process of dialogue, of experimentation, of circulation. Yesterday, for example, in Parque Castilla, it's a park that is closer to my place, there was a Constitutional Sunday where they summoned neighbors just to sit down and talk. What don't you like about the Constitution? What do you want to change about it? So I think that these small attempts to bring forward the dialogue are potentially powerful, because they are sedimented over these feelings of anger, of outrage, of looking for justice, of becoming into something together. And I think that the becoming word is very important for me, at least in the way I'm understanding this protest, because we don't know exactly what people want. We know that there are many different sources of disenchantment, right? And they are connected right now. So we need to pay closer attention to what they may become. And then to what about the next year? I think that, of course, President Sagasti has a very difficult task to steer the country out of economic crisis and out of the sanitary crisis, while also trying to implement some of these progressive reforms that people are starting to demand from him. And I think it's going to be incredibly challenging, especially considering that the side that staged the coup d'etat, the constitutional coup d'etat, that is still in the Congress. So they have not been nor punished, nor even symbolically punished. They are still there. I am a bit worried, however, about the first steps he has taken in regards to bringing the police into accountability. His choice was to remove the high command of the police and bring to the foreground a person of his own personal trust, I think. But this has ignited a very strong condemnation by the police itself. And again, quoting journalist Gustavo Gorriti, this move may not have ignited the same rejection had it been focused surgically, like precisely, on the chain of command associated to police protest. So it remains the paradox. These are examples of an alleged police reform, but at the same time, those responsible are still under impunity. I'm a bit concerned about these first expressions because they are talking to me about about misfired attempts to regain the people's trust. So I think we need to follow this closely. And as a Peruvian rapper said, we are watching over you. That's the only thing we have in our hands right now, watch over him.
Omar?
Yes, I fully agree with most of what Gisselle mentioned. And I just wanted to think about what I call, thinking about the capacity we had to oust Merino in only 6 days, right? That was the headline of many newspapers, how Peruvians could defeat an authoritarian attempt in just 6 days. So we are a very powerful civil society with the capacity to do this. So in part, yes, because of the two reasons I was mentioning, right? The threats that this government meant and the repression it used that outraged most of civil society. But it's also because the government is very weak, right? It was not only Merino. So now we're thinking, yeah, because the political scientist Stephen Levitsky, I think, said something like this is probably the most stupid coup coup attempt during the 21st century, right? So yeah, but they were very they didn't have a very clear plan of what to do, right? But it's not only Merino, it's not only this Congress. In general, if we think about the governments that we had since 2 decades ago, they were pretty weak. And as Gisselle was mentioning, we have the capacity to make them step back, right? To pressure them against some of the reforms. So we can do that, because these governments in general are pretty weak, because we don't have parties. So they are very different from the Chilean government or the Colombian government. So in Chile, for instance, they had over 30 students who were murdered, like 4,500 people injured during the protests, and Piñeras is still there. And that's not because the Chilean people is weaker than the Peruvian people. It's because their political system is stronger, their party system is stronger, right? So this is what I call like the paradox of the democracy without parties. So we have these politicians, very short-minded, very interested only in their own very, very narrow interests that create this all kind of crisis in the last 2 decades. But at the same time, they are so weak that we can push them back whenever it is necessary. But it is way easier to push them back than to make them walk forward with us, right? And for that, as Gisselle was mentioning, we need, for that, I think we need organizations. We need some more organizations to keep pressing these politicians to organize, to connect better with political parties, right? So the left, for instance, in Peru is pretty weak. It's not connected with social organizations. And even when they want to connect, even when they want to build organizations, they can't. And they are more focused on electoral movements. I mean, into building electoral movements. And that's a problem, of course. And the second point I wanted to mention is the military that also Gisselle mentioned, right? In the military, the role of the military is also important to understand what happened in the last 2 weeks, right? Because yeah, we organized, we had these large protests, but we also succeeded because the government was weak, this coalition government, but also because the armed forces, the military, decided not to pay attention to the demands of this government. And why is this? I have a couple of hypotheses. So the first hypothesis is that, of course, they saw that 94% of Peruvians are against this government and it was not like it was not an intelligent move to support such a discredited coalition. But the second one, and I think that's what I am more interested in testing or trying to see if this is true. It's because we had just transitional justice. So our transition 2 decades ago was full of mistakes, was full of broken promises. Yes, we didn't have a police reform. We didn't have a justice reform. We didn't have a new constitution. Okay, so it was not good. But at least we had transitional justice. We have this Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We had many politicians and many military forces that were part of human rights violations. They were in jail, they got in jail, we got them in jail, or they were in a lot of trials until they died. And this created a lesson. I have talked with many military people in the last 2 or 3 years, I guess, and their perception is that it's not that they have embraced this normative preference for democracy and so that would prevent them to intervene in politics, but they have learned from this fear of being judged, of being taken to courts, and that's why they try not to mess with what the civilians are doing. They try not to get involved into politics. So that is something that is very important, because I think in many countries in Latin America you cannot count on that self-restraint from the military. And finally, for the future, I think, again, I wanted to go back to this idea that we need actual organizations in order to press politicians to move forward with us, right? And there is where I think, for example, students, university students in general are organizing. So I have heard in the last couple of weeks, a lot of meetings with student organizations, and many students have been organizing, like they have formed organizations, new organizations, to discuss precisely about the Constitutional Assembly and what people actually want and what could be the new forms to actually get there, right? So I think that is important to have people actually participate in creating new organizations in order to participate, to push political parties to actually listen to our demands.
Right. Yeah. So I absolutely agree with you, both of you. I think there is a risk of having these protests, and when the claims then are, in a way, the government reacts, but then they make things to change the things, no? And with clear consultation, I think that is clear and it's clear in other stuff. But probably, I mean, there is some hope here in this new movement that are emerging from this. They are looking for new ways of organization. And I think in 2000 that was not the case. And in that case, I think we were more like the traditional way to try to organize but this context is asking for also reforms there. And I think that is there is a need to try to understand better for that. So this claim for the new constitution, what means? So probably people don't want an assembly next year with this Congress. We need a different constitutional process, a different thing, and to push the political system to that will be huge for Peru if that happens. So we need to see what is coming in the next years. So I think there is a question from the audience. I don't see it. So I think we can, I just want to thank you a lot for this. I think super interesting for me, and I'm sure for the audience. And let's see if we can try to organize something around the elections in April next year, and to try to see how this has developed. That would be nice to have a follow-up of this next year, if you agree. And thank you for Bergen Global and Neutron Forum for organizing this. And thanks a lot for your participation.